are live and three, two.
Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, July 26th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. The name AWARE stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established almost 15 years ago after the counterattacks on New York and Washington of September 11, 2001 that killed 3,000 Americans. The founders of AWARE were citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that instead of going after the people who committed the 9/11 crimes, the U.S. government would use those crimes as an excuse to continue its already long-standing attempt to control the Middle East and its energy resources with military force, that is, by killing people. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. That control benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%, and not Americans in general, who've seen wealth concentrate in fewer and fewer hands at an accelerating rate throughout the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. The greatest crime of the 21st century, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which killed 1 million people, was not a response to 9/11, but to Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, which Washington knew was a lie. The Republican and Democrat political conventions this week lead us to think about what our government actually does. It has likely been responsible since World War II for the deaths of between 20 million and 30 million people in some 37 nations for the profits of the 1%. Martin Luther King was right to say that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. The conduct of President Obama, and probably future President Clinton, is consistent with this horrible record. President Obama was elected with the support of those who thought he would end the wars started by the Bush administration. Instead, he attacked 8 countries. George Bush only attacked 6. Obama's drone assassinations, the New York Times says he chooses the targets himself from lists prepared by the CIA, have killed thousands of civilians, not just the hundreds he admits to, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. In addition to conducting wars throughout the Mideast, the Obama administration is acting with belligerence towards China and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, which has already killed more people than Israel killed, with U.S. permission, in Gaza in 2014. The president also commands through the National Security Council a 70,000-member private army, the Special Operations Command, active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, murder, and torture. In a book of the 2012 campaign, Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." Close quote. However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. Glenn Ford writes correctly, "Decent people do not vote for political parties that produce such fiends. Any talk of lesser evils is both stupid and obscene." Hillary Clinton, responsible for horrors in Honduras, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere, would only continue and intensify the warmongering of recent administrations, the blowback from which is now producing terrorist attacks in Europe and America. Whatever you may think of Donald Trump as a presidential candidate, his comments on foreign policy have broken with this horrible record. He has, for example, proposed diplomacy, he speaks of deals, with Russian President Putin, whom Clinton, on the contrary, has called the new Hitler, instead of the insane provocations of Russia by the Obama administration. I'll be voting for Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate for president, whose positions on these and other matters are substantially better than those of the major party candidates. But I won't be dissuaded by the argument that a vote for a third-party candidate is helping Trump. Trump is clearly better than Clinton on America's murderous foreign policy. Our program is based on the conviction that the U.S. government is once again today lying about why it's killing people around the world. And it's lying primarily to the only enemy it really fears, the U.S. public. The U.S. government claims that our military, by far the most expensive in the world, is causing death and destruction around the world in pursuit of peace and freedom. That isn't true. It's protecting the 1%'s economic hegemony. So the orthodox bipartisan establishment, Republican and Democrat alike, have reacted with horror to Donald Trump's anti-war proposals for fear that they will be popular. More than 40 years ago, the U.S. government withdrew from an illegal war in Vietnam because Americans demanded it. By 1969, polls showed that 70% of the U.S. population regarded the war in Vietnam not as a mistake, but as, quote, fundamentally wrong and immoral, close quote. As in Southeast Asia then, so now in Southwest Asia, the U.S. must end its criminal war. We demand that President Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, 1, end the drone assassinations, 2, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, 3, close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases around the world. Neither Russia nor China has more than 12. 4, end the provocations of Russia and East Europe and China and the South China Sea. 5, end support for Israel's apartheid policy and stop sending them money and weapons. And 6, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, and their clients to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much about it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Ron Zook.
A couple of tidbits before I get to the main theme, which will be the party platforms of the two parties. I said a little bit about the Republican one last week, I think. But both Russia and China are getting into the American mode now of displaying their new hardware and their high-tech weapons. Note in the news, China has exhibited in Zhuhai, southern China, a homemade largest amphibious airplane in the world in a continuing attempt to build an independent airplane industry, the AG-600. It's about the size of a Boeing 737, it said. It has 4 6-bladed propellers and is intended, according to China, for entirely civilian peaceful uses, fighting forest fires and maritime rescues. If you look in YouTube, you'll find many references to the advanced, ultra-sophisticated airplanes being built by Russia now. In addition to the MiGs, the several other brands that we're supposed to be impressed by, and indeed, they seem very fearsome indeed. So whether we're going to have another showdown in ultra-sophisticated technology with China and Russia now, the way we did with the USSR, I think is an open question. One of the principal interpretations of the fall of the Soviet Union is that they were trying to keep up with us in the arms race and develop equal and opposite weapons to those used by the USA, and it broke them. They couldn't continue that kind of development and spending, although they were never really a serious threat to the USA. But that's another matter. Back to the familiar theme of Turkey, what has happened there, we've been reading that thousands of people have been dismissed, enormous purge of all those with public sector jobs, teachers, judges, and so on. And hundreds apparently have been incarcerated. One of the conditions of admission to the European Union, something that Turkey has been seeking apparently for years, is that abolition of the death penalty. And Turkey has apparently talked about that, but is now saying absolutely not, we want the death penalty back, to deal with these coup plotters. And Angela Merkel has said, no way you're getting into the European Union if you retain the death penalty, which obviously they want to use, apparently with this guy Gulen, who's a resident of Pennsylvania in the USA, and they're demanding his extradition. And so the American air base in Sirleck has become a bargaining chip in this process, apparently. The USA wants to retain the air base there, which is the location of the biggest nuclear weapons store in all of Europe, apparently. But it's the base we use for bombing Syria and Iraq, and we don't want to give that up. But apparently it would be within the power of Turkey to close it down, and so they have an enormous bargaining chip there. Agence France Presse, July 18th. Key base near Syria risks new Turkey-U.S. tensions. Incirlik houses 1,500 U.S. troops and is just 70 miles from the Syrian border. It has notably been used to deploy drones, Prowler electric airplanes, and A-10 ground attack aircraft in the fight against ISIS. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said Saturday that Washington would assist Turkey in the investigation of the failed coup and invited Ankara to share any evidence it has against Gulen. And so it goes. Kerry has warned Turkey that its actions could have NATO consequences, but it didn't spell out what that would be. The U.S. diplomat's remarks, delivered at a meeting of the European Union's 28 foreign ministers, came as authorities acting on behalf of President Erdogan sacked more than 8,000 police officers and officials in a massive effort launched in the aftermath of the coup, according to the Washington Post and Reuters. So we have a dilemma, maintaining the global dominance of the USA and its ability to harass Russia and other disliked parties there in the southwest of Asia is going to require some significant diplomatic efforts. And we'll see how that turns out. Let me turn briefly then to the two-party platforms. I think I mentioned the Republican platform next week. According to Jeremy Ben-Ami of J Street, the 2016 Republican platform withdraws support for the two-state solution, deletes all references to Palestinians, and makes a point of emphatically rejecting the notion that Israel is an occupying power in the West Bank. These positions move the GOP far outside the American consensus and place the party at odds not only with the 80% of Jewish Americans who support two states, but with the stated position of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Apparently he's wavered on that a good deal. But anyway, Republican abandonment of its commitment to restoring resolving the conflict and securing Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state lines the party up with the minority of Israelis who support a settlement movement and the one-state annexionists. The Democratic platform has been posted in the past few days. The preamble says, well, the usual fluff that no one could disagree with for the most part. Concerning the American economy, too many Americans have been left out and left behind. They are working longer hours with less security. Wages have barely budged, and the racial wealth gap remains wide, while the cost of everything from child care to college education has continued to rise. For too many families, the dream of home ownership is out of reach. As working people struggle, the top 1% accrues more wealth and more power. Republicans in Congress have chosen gridlock and dysfunction over trying to find solutions to the real challenges we face. It's no wonder that so many feel like the system is rigged against them. Then to get to the paragraph relevant to the Middle East, a strong and secure Israel is vital to the United States because we share overarching strategic interests and the common values of democracy, equality, tolerance, and pluralism. Note the shift there that goes on so frequently in American statements. It's our values that we're trying to protect there, but this will be done with pragmatic realism concerning our interests. We will always support Israel's right to defend itself, including by retaining its qualitative military edge, and oppose any effort to delegitimize Israel, including at the United Nations or through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I understand there's a high-level representative of Israel in Washington today wanting more military aid. We will continue to work toward a two-state solution of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, negotiated directly by the parties, that guarantees Israel's future as a secure and democratic Jewish state with recognized borders, and provides the Palestinians with independence, sovereignty, and dignity. While Jerusalem is a matter for final status negotiations, it should remain the capital of Israel, an undivided city accessible to people of all faiths. Israelis deserve security, recognition, and a normal life free from terror and incitement. Palestinians should be free to govern themselves in their own viable state in peace and dignity, a provision notably absent from the Republican statement. Depending on who you ask, the Times said, in these Times publication, the 2016 Democratic platform is either the most progressive platform in Democratic Party history or, quote, a major betrayal. Regardless of how you view it, however, there's no denying that the platform compromises on certain core progressive values, and some of that can be traced to the platform drafting committee, which met last month to hammer out a first draft. So there's some speculation on Moyers and Company by one Branko Marksetic. He says, disappointed by the Democratic Party platform, follow the money. Several delegates to the platform drafting committee have deep financial ties to conservative industries. So there's no news in that. A lot of the Republican position papers and the platform seem to have been written by various lobbyists, and this has long been the case, particularly in the case of the Democratic platform. So how seriously should we take these platform statements? Well, there's a lot of opinion on that. I think the predominant one in the circles that I'm familiar with says not at all. They have only kind of symbolic value, and they're full of feel-good stuff, but we can't depend on them to show us the direction that the parties will take when they actually assume power, if they ever do. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to David Green.
Yeah, gosh, here I am. I'm going to read a statement from a book. Ron, you've broached the idea of reading platform statements on Aware on the Air. I don't know. It's pretty interesting that platforms never get talked about once the election is over, or even during the campaign itself.
Yeah, there's a reason for that.
Even after Labor Day, nobody's going to be talking about the platforms of the Democratic and Republican Party. They're only going to be talking about whatever banal statements are being made by Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump,
Sure.
which are all, of course, self-serving and not particularly sincere. I was interested to hear you talk about the the Israel-Palestine platforms, but in effect, Trump moved to the right because he has to please Sheldon Adelson.
Right.
Clinton will pretend to be slightly on the left, even though she's really not. And so there's sort of much ado about nothing in terms of any real outcomes for the Palestinian people. But let me turn to, perhaps we can take that up again. I guess I was looking to sort of go back and maybe be a little bit more informative about this American project, this American state capitalist global project that is summarized in a book that I've mentioned frequently both on this show and Views from Neptune over the last couple of years, The Making of Global Capitalism by Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin. And in one of the introductory chapters to this book, they talk about the American century and the new planning for the new American empire during World War II. And it's pretty well known that Henry Luce, the publisher of Time and Life magazines at that time, coined the phrase "the American century." It took him until the 1940s to actually do that. It took him 40 years to realize that the 20th century was yes, indeed, the American century. The document I'm going to refer to here is called An American Proposal, published in May 1942. The editors of Fortune, Time, and Life magazines jointly published a statement entitled An American Proposal, the product of a series of roundtable discussions between prominent businessmen held under Fortune's auspices since late 1939, over that 3-year period. The footnote to this statement reads as follows: An American Proposal, Fortune magazine, May 1942. This joint Fortune, Time, and Life editorial introduced a series of reports on, quote, the United States in a New World. Of course, this was 6 months after we'd entered into World War II, and its potential courses of action. The first on relations with Britain, and the second later in the year on relations with the Far East. The famous Life magazine editorial, February 17th, 1940, on the American century, which of course would have been before America entered the war, by Henry Luce, the owner of all 3 magazines, who also wrote the preface to An American Proposal, should be seen as part of this exercise. So Panitch and Gindin write, The American Proposal of May 1942 began with the premise that, quote, America will emerge as the strongest single power in the post-war world, and it is therefore up to it to decide what kind of post-war world it wants, end quote. End quote from the article, American Proposal. And Panitch and Gindin go on. The momentous implications of this proposition had been recognized at the very first roundtable, the series of roundtables of prominent businessmen that had been held since 1939. Its primary interest it had declared was in, quote, the longer range question of whether the American capitalist system should continue to function, should continue to function if most of Europe and Asia should abolish free enterprise, end quote. The priority of the next peace, quote unquote, was, quote, to organize the economic resources of the world so as to make possible a return to the system of free enterprise in every country. And free enterprise, of course, is this term of art for American corporate capitalism with monopolistic aspects, of course, but free enterprise in the sense that, not in the sense that the state wouldn't be involved. Panitch and Gindin's argument is the state has always been highly involved with that, but that corporations, the fundamental purpose of this American system, American governance system, would be to benefit the corporate bottom lines and American corporate hegemony in the global economy. So Panitch and Gindin go on. The proposal recognized that the old open door strategy would be inadequate to spread the area of freedom, quote unquote, throughout the post-war world, meaning the open door strategy towards the Far East, mainly China, that had characterized American foreign policy in the late 1800s and early 1900s. While this ultimate goal, quote unquote, remained universal free trade, quote unquote, it was, quote, no longer an immediate political possibility, end quote, primarily because of the uprising of the international proletariat, which was the most significant fact of the last 20 years. So we see here that the planners at the beginning of World War II were worried about the uprising of the international proletariat, including this in this country, that had occurred since the 1920s, and especially during the depression of the 1930s. They were extremely concerned about the possible results of this in the wake, of course, of the existence of the Soviet Union. Panjin didn't go on. For this reason, realizing the ultimate goal of universal free trade, first of all, required remaking the world states so that not only tariffs, but also subsidies, monopolies, restrictive labor rules, plantation feudalism, poll taxes, technological backwardness, obsolete tax laws, and all other barriers to further expansion could be removed. It was necessary, the authors of the proposal declared, to replace a dead or dying imperialism with an American empire of a new kind. And here is a paragraph quoted from this report of 1942. A new American imperialism, if it is to be called that, will, or rather can, be quite different from the British type. It can also be different from the premature American type that followed our expansion in the Spanish War. American imperialism can afford to complete the work the British started. Instead of salesmen and planters, its representatives can be brains and bulldozers, technicians and machine tools. American imperialism does not need extraterritoriality. It can get along better in Asia if the Tuans and Sahibs stay home. Nor is the U.S. afraid to help build up industrial rivals to its own power, because we know industrialization stimulates rather than limits international trade. This American imperialism sounds very abstemious and high-minded. It is nevertheless a feasible policy for America, because friendship, not food, is what we need most from the rest of the world. So this is the kind of sort of practical, I think it's fair to call it, of kind of idealism professed by the American planners, the high-level American planners like Henry Luce back in the 1940s. Panjin didn't go on, yet the proposal was by no means a case of capitalists imposing an agenda on the state. Responsibility for leadership, quote unquote, and the U.S.'s great economic strength that had thrust such responsibility upon it, these were terms being widely employed inside the Roosevelt administration since 1939 to refer to what would be the American state's unique role after the war in enabling the internationalizing dynamic of capitalism to operate once again. The main contribution of the proposal, as its preface recognized, was to help in establishing some, quote, some agreement among ourselves in what we are prepared to do and to undertake, end quote. It was primarily an exercise in building public and especially business support for the strategy already being developed inside the state. That its role was going to be very different than that played by any of the imperial powers in the past was also coming to be recognized outside the U.S. Quote, let there be no mistake about it, The Economist, the British journal, wrote in July 1942. The foreign policy put forward by the American administration is revolutionary. It is a genuinely new conception of the world order, end quote. And Panjin continue. Those who were involved in planning the new imperial project were certainly aware of how difficult it would be to realize it. All the more so because the exact impact of the depression and the war on the structures of U.S. capitalism and the state, let alone the balance of international forces, was by no means yet clear. It was a project necessarily cast in terms of finding solutions to problems the American state had already been forced to confront and had previously lacked the capacity to resolve. Dean Acheson, seen by many as the leading architect of post-war American strategy, began his famous autobiography, present at the creation, with the observation that the period, this World War II period, quote, was one of great obscurity of those who lived through it. Not only was the future clouded, a common enough situation, but the present was equally clouded. The significance of events was shrouded in ambiguity. We groped after interpretations of them, sometimes reversed lines of action based on earlier views, and hesitated long before grasping what now seems obvious, end quote. And then to end this segment by Panninchin Gindin, yet a growing conviction was certainly developing within the American state that, as one of Acheson's biographers puts it, quote, only the U.S. had the power to grab hold of history and make it conform, end quote. Intimations of Fukuyama's infamous end of history thesis 50 years later, proclaiming the triumph of a global capitalism in the image of the U.S. are already unmistakable here, but as the basis for a project yet to be launched as opposed to one already accomplished. So let me just conclude by saying that it's important to understand that one could argue that since the late 1900s, certainly since World War I, but especially since World War II, the American elites have thought of the global economy as their domain, as their playground, as their world to manipulate in the way that would conform to what American corporations refer to as free enterprise. We entered a new neoliberal era, neoliberal neoconservative era in the 1970s, but the legacy of what we're dealing with in terms of foreign policy goes back. It could go back to the starting of this country. It certainly goes back to the late 1800s, and we're certainly dealing with a long-term and deeply and densely institutionalized project to literally control the flow of capital into every area of this world, and that's what takes American military into every area of this world that it can possibly go into.
Thank you, David. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the American penchant for war and the reasons behind it. I want to suggest to both of you, on the basis of what you've presented this evening, the party platforms for the upcoming presidential election, and an account of how the U.S. got here into the American century that we just heard. It seems to me that what this election, the Trump-Clinton election, as it's turning out to be, is about is American decline. Now, the difference is that the two campaigns, and I think that's probably the way we should speak of it rather than parties, because the campaigns have coalesced around the figures, the two campaigns think of that decline differently. For Clinton and the people around her, the decline from that pinnacle of success that characterized America after the Second World War that David was just talking about, for the Clinton people, that decline is finally military. And it has to be reasserted. America has to be reasserted military, and Clinton, the butcher of Libya and so forth, is just the person to do it. The notion is that it was the American military success, first of all in World War II, and then also after World War II, that established America's greatness. You can argue about that greatness, but the greatness certainly meant the profits of the American 1%, which dominated the world economy for 2 generations after the Second World War. It was military prowess that put it there, and it was military prowess that kept it there, in the sense of the military reorganization of Europe and a military confrontation, in a sense, with the rest of the world. Ron has talked about the American base system, which we take for granted. Of course, the Americans have bases around the world, but if you step back and note that America has 1,000 military bases around the world and no other country has anything anywhere near approaching that, then we understand something about the way in which that American hegemony was established, literally for generations. The Clinton people say, yes, that's right, and we got to be very careful that that doesn't decline, because there are people out there trying to take it away from it, take it away from us, most notably President Putin of Russia, and Russian aggression has to be established, but we can't forget the Chinese either, because their aggression from the other side, a sneaky backdoor attack on us through the South China Sea, also has to be dealt with militarily. So we get this Clintonian account of how the American decline is to be arrested. It's to be arrested by military force. What's absolutely remarkable in this presidential campaign is that it's also an analysis of decline, but a different prescription that we're getting from the Trump campaign. Trump's acceptance speech the other night may be one of the strangest, and it may turn out to be one of the more important documents in recent American history. Because what he talked about was, under his mantra of making America great again, became clear that the great America he had in mind was very roughly the economic world of the last generation, the world in which Americans could count on good jobs, rising incomes, practically free college. That's what the GI Bill provided for that generation. The other things that made for upward mobility. Now, however you want to measure that upward mobility, it's stalled. And because of the fact that it has done so for 80% of Americans, Trump is pulling out of that particular situation, support for his campaign. The American decline is real, say the Trumpistas, but the fundamental issue is not military. The fundamental issue is economic, and that has to be reversed. People have to be given the opportunity that the parents' generation seem to have had to rise. So we have a narrative of decline. Neither side is quite willing to say decline, because that would be giving up, that would be admitting defeat. But they both think it's true, they both know it's true, it is true, and they want to talk about what's to be done. But what we get from that, I think, is a clashing vision, and that the election may be decided, in some sense, on the basis of which vision people find more compelling. And given the war weariness that the Obama administration has been trying to sweep under the rug for 8 years, I must admit I'm beginning to think, like I would not have said a month ago, that the smart money is on Trump. Comments?
Well, it seems to me that very largely the reverse is the case. The liberals rarely think of military action first. Their preference is always to infiltrate and subvert the economy. And if that doesn't work, then they will resort to the military.
Say that again, Ron. I don't understand that. The liberals, who are they, and what economy are they subverting?
Russia, for example, prime example, or any other potentially hostile state. And I think military action is typically a second choice for them, whereas it's the other way around.
Even with the NATO provocations in Eastern Europe?
Yes, and even in the face of all that.
Even in the liberal interventionists of the sort to populate the upper reaches of the Obama administration?
Look, they are recent acquisitions of that. They have a long history with the Republican Party. But in any case, okay, Carl, I know your line very well, and there will be no possibility of persuading anyone of anything at this point. But I would just say that my impression is that it has worked the other way around. The liberals, whatever term of abuse you want to use, prefer economic penetration and domination first, and then they'll talk about American values, and then later switch to talking about American interests when that becomes necessary. And I'm afraid that on the conservative side, the first thought is typically how do we deal with this militarily? But there's no way of proving that either way. And I would just offer that as my interpretation of a whole lot that has gone on.
David?
Well, it's hard to know where to jump into this, and because decline. It's, I mean, one of the arguments that Panitch and Ginden make in this long book that kind of separates them from some of the views is that yes, they would certainly acknowledge that America has declined in terms of perhaps it's declined in terms of its ability to marshal the use of force as it did through, up until Vietnam. That we can't invade countries the way we used to. We can't quite control the economies of countries the way we used to, although they argue that we get elites in other countries to do that pretty well, and that as this phrase goes, American corporations, the American state has created a world after its own image, and that the one distinction there is that it may not always be after its own interests in terms of the manner in which elites in other countries are able to extract concessions, but they operate within this American global economic hegemonic framework. And the question I've always had about Panitch and Ginden is, if Americans have been so successful at getting this whole globalized financial capitalism to work in a way that these people in 1940s couldn't really have conceived of, even though they wanted it, why have we needed to use so much violence, especially since the Vietnam War, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union? Why have we needed to use so much military violence to maintain this? And I think the decline that you referred to, I mean, we have to look at in absolute terms, in terms of the status of the working class in this country, the unrest of the working classes in Europe, the uprising from Latin America, the so-called pink revolution or pink tide in various countries. There have been all these cracks. There's all this going on, but it's decline, but it's also there's a push and a pull. Mm-hmm. So you've got to deal with the fact that we're dealing with long-term efforts of people around the globe to assert themselves in various ways. And in the midst of all that, American capitalism, the American financial system, the American dollar is still the global currency. And that gives an enormous amount of power to the American state, including to fund our military adventures. As long as other countries are investing in our national debt, we can afford to fund our and as long as our dollar is the global currency, we can afford to basically print the money to fund our military around the world. So decline, I mean, yes, it's obvious in the conflict, but and Trump is speaking to that, and Sanders spoke to that.
Right.
So, but it's hard, I wouldn't want to see it as any inevitable, inexorable process. It's just it's a product of struggle, functional, dysfunctional, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, this question of managing American decline has come up repeatedly in the past 2 or 3 decades, and it's typically ridiculed by a whole lot of pundits. But
yeah,
I think it's pretty obvious to me.
I would say that. Chomsky certainly buys into the notion
yes.
of American decline, and just that we can't control the world the way we used to, and our own people are suffering for the neoliberal reforms.
There are neocon pundits, though, who
Yeah.
say, well, that can't be true. Just look at our firepower, which is absolutely overwhelming.
Exactly. We should be clear that decline here, people are impressed, I think, with having heard about a book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire when they were young, you know, and had taken a sort of historical model from that. And the constant refrain, which goes back to the founding of the United States, is the United States like Rome, and if so, how? As if there was a pattern out there for us to follow, and the pattern had been established in the first few centuries of the Christian era by the Romans. I'm not sure that's a very helpful model, interesting as it is to read Gibbon as well as he wrote, but the fact of the matter is that there is a decline today in America from that unquestioned hegemony that America exercised after the Second World War. We forget sometime as Americans, because of our mythology of the Second World War, that America was the only undamaged major country to emerge from the Second World War. All other countries, winners or losers, had lost a great deal. There may have been 500,000 American casualties in the course of the Second World War. There were 27 million Russian casualties. The war in Europe was not run on the beaches of Normandy. It was won in the east, on the Russian front, and it was there that the entire German army practically remained throughout the war, even after the invasion of Normandy. So I mean, the sort of control, military and economic, that the U.S. had in 1945 was unprecedented, even by the Roman Empire, by the way. It's that control that George Kennan was talking about when he said 4 years later, we have 5% of the world's population and 50% of the world's wealth, and obviously the rest of the world's not going to want that to maintain, and we have to work very hard to maintain the disparity. Well, decline has to do with maintaining the disparity. We haven't been able to maintain the disparity because, as Ron suggested, the other countries have expanded economically, socially, and every other ways. So much so that China has a 21st century rail system and the United States has a 19th century rail system. It's just shocking to see the difference of the two. But the fact of the matter is that the American policy has been a policy of trying to maintain that economic dominance. That was the issue, as was just suggested, but by military force. Military force gave it to us, Second World War, or so it seemed, and therefore military force could save it to us. And if some peculiar Southeast Asians want to run their own economy outside of our world economy, they can't do it. And we'll kill a lot of them to make sure that they understand that they can't do it. 4 million dead Southeast Asian later, the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, but it wasn't defeated in Vietnam. The U.S. had established the principle that it ran the world economy for the benefit of the American elite, and the rest of the world had to take notice. And so now South Vietnam, and now Vietnam desperately wants American shoe manufacturers to come open plants, you know.
It would be, you know, it's understandable that this is all might seem as confusing. I mean, Trump wants to make America great again. He's buying into the notion. I mean, it is unlearned. I mean, I'm sure he has nothing resembling a sophisticated analytical thought about any of this. He has this idea that America was great because it was in the post-World War II terms that you refer to, and that he thinks it could be great again, meaning in those terms, meaning that America could have a working class that is like a middle class. And something tells him that in his crude way, but correct, sort of instinctively correct way, that the fact that we're mixed up around the rest of the world the way we are militarily contributes to the decline of the American middle class. And so something about this, in its dysfunctional and racist and xenophobic way, resonates with people in a way that is, in a way, his foreign policy, since we're here to talk about foreign policy, in a way that was more honest than what Sanders was saying about foreign policy, about that implying that we can't afford to take care of Europe's issues, with whatever they might be, with NATO, that somehow we're spending too much money on protecting other countries, even though while he says he wants to put boots on the ground to deal with ISIS and all this. I mean, he'll say anything, but at the bottom it seems like he feels like we can have this dominance back, but the dominance that we had was dependent on our control of the world economy. We could be a great country again, but not on those terms. And the middle class, the working class as a middle class, isn't going to come back on those terms. It could come back on the terms that Bernie Sanders outlined, but Bernie Sanders didn't talk about dealing with how our role in the world undermines the American working class, how our role in the world has basically caused our leadership to sacrifice the American working class in order to control the global capitalist economy.
Well, let me get this straight. You say that
I'm not sure if I have it straight, but I'm giving it a shot.
Trump is more honest because he doesn't really mean what he's saying, and
I think in some way he means yeah.
And then the Democrats are talking about inequality, which is their big main point, are being insincere. They don't.
Sanders was being sincere in talking about inequality. Hillary Clinton is not being insincere. She has no track record of being sincere in talking about inequality. I mean, that's what the Clintons have been all about, increasing neoliberal inequality in this country. So I don't see how anything Clinton says about inequality can be taken seriously. It's just a sop to the Sanders supporters. And whereas Sanders might have made a better case for inequality by including a harsh critique of foreign policy, Clinton is unwilling to do any such. Is unwilling to do any such thing because she is a neolib neocon. I mean, she is someone who subscribes to this notion that goes back to the early 1940s that America should be controlling the world, and she is much more dedicated to that idea than either Sanders or Trump.
Yeah, well, my impression is they try the obfuscation of talk about American values first, and then if that doesn't seem to be working, they'll talk about American interests and then send in the Marines. But yeah.
Well,
I think it may be true that the election will be fought out over Trump's mantra, make America great again. Now, what did we hear last night from some of the Democrats? Oh, America is already great. That was the answer. In other words, that for good or ill, Trump has defined the playing field upon which this will be worked out. Making America great again. Is it necessary? If so, how do we have to do it? Well, I think he's won the first part of the argument, that most Americans listening to this say, yeah, it is necessary. There are an awful lot of things wrong, from race to war, from economy to economic development as a whole. So how do we go about it? Unfortunately for them, the Clinton people are in the position of having to argue the way to do it is to stop foreign aggression. The Russians and Chinese and others who are taking our stuff away somehow, or at least threatening to, and that America becomes great again when we're not having little people like Vladimir Putin thumb their nose at us. And that's worked in the past, but I'm not sure it's going to work in the future. Trump et al. Are saying we'll make America great again when Americans don't have to worry about crime, when Americans don't have to worry about losing their jobs to foreigners or anybody else, when Americans don't have to worry about themselves slipping into personal economic decline because of what the country is doing around the world. And that, for all the problems that one might point out about it, I think is going to turn out to be a winning proposition. It could be very interesting indeed in that regard. You've been watching Aware on the Air. Concluding comments, gentlemen? Do we have things that should be said before we go?
Well, a quick note on what's happening in Latin America. There, when you have conflict, and you get this idea that out of every conflict is an opportunity, and we can impose
Don't
free
waste a
market.
crisis.
Don't waste a crisis. We can impose free market capitalism, something that we will call that in Latin America too. Naomi Klein is good at this point.
Yeah, I would only conclude by saying, as I'm always getting back to the idea of what money is and how money is being used. And in 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard, and that was thought as an aspect of American decline at that time. But some analyze it when that's the point at which the dollar became the global currency. And ironically, I think American decline will only be stopped, in a sense, when the dollar no longer is the global currency, when we just compete on a quote-unquote level playing field with the other countries in the world in terms of our exports and our imports and our trade and our productivity and our technology and so forth. So the ruling classes of this country take it for granted that the dollar is going to be the global currency, and that everybody that provides a certain control over what's going on in the world, both economically and militarily. And that may seem like a too sophisticated point to make behind all this electoral politics, and you won't hear it being talked about. But I think it's important for the American people to begin to understand that we have no more right to have the global currency than any other country, and the people of this country, the masses of people in this country, would be much better off. It would be possible for us to be better off when that is no longer the case. It will be difficult for the working class, the middle class, to be better off, as long as this is the case, and as long as the dollar is the global currency, as long as it's overvalued, as long as it's used to foment war in the Middle East and other places.
Don't you think there's a lot of apprehension that the euro and the yuan are coming up fast on the outside?
Yeah, I mean those are pretty technical points, but there's still there is apprehension about that, but it's still, and this gets back to the central parts of Pan Shingin's argument, is that America is declining, but it's still the American world. It's still global capitalism, American style. I guess one way of putting it, there are a quantitative decline in various ways, but qualitatively, we are still great. It's just that the people of this country can't feel like they're great anymore when they're in student debt, et cetera, et cetera.
I think when we all come before the throne of the Most High to give an account of what we've done, it may be a little difficult to answer for America of our generation that we killed 20 to 30 million people around the world in order to keep the dollar as the world's major currency. And I think that may in fact be true. So you have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 30th week of 2016. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks of ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, terrible as they are, but by President Obama's drone assassination program, which has killed thousands and is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Joseph Cash, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Who was the Democratic operative this week who said Snowden should be murdered because we can't really get at him legally? Now, this is Carl Esterbrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck. Thank you, sir.